Lecture 28, Napoleon and the Mantle of Caesar.
Julius Caesar did not need myths to transform him into a hero. There were myths about Julius Caesar in the Middle Ages, one of them having him be named a bishop of the church. That would have amused Caesar, who was quite a womanizer and a drinker. But he was, in fact, the high priest of Rome, already elected to that office in 63 BC. And then he was one of the 9 worthies of the Middle Ages. That selection from the Bible and from ancient history and the contemporary history that decorates so many cathedrals and stained glasses. For example, David and Joshua and Judas Maccabees from the Old Testament, and Caesar and Alexander and Hector from antiquity, and Godfrey of Bouillon, who conquered the city of Jerusalem in the First Crusade, and Arthur and Charlemagne. So Caesar was ranked in that company. But the real myth of Caesar, the real profound truth, was world conquest, world rule, world order. The mantle of Caesar. There have been many who have tried to wear that mantle of Caesar, to become the world historical individual that brings the entire globe together in one global economy with one global government. It is a goal which some seem to wish to pursue today. But none wore that mantle with more dignity and glory than Napoleon. And Napoleon set out from his early school days to become a new Caesar. Like most of the schoolboys of his time in France, but also in Britain and Germany, he read Caesar's commentaries, that extraordinary work, which is a perfect example of Caesar's foresight. What he needed, his short-term problem, was to let the Roman people know what he was doing in Gaul, so that false rumors, lies would not be spread again about him. Instead, he created a work, just dictating it, that would be a masterpiece of Latin prose and a model of history and a model of how to be a successful general. And the young Napoleon studied it. He had a long way to go, and he reached it. So be with me on June the 22nd. The year is 1812, and we are about to cross into Russia with the Grande Armée of the Emperor Napoleon. He did not have to cry at the age of 40, as Caesar did, because he had achieved nothing. At this time, Napoleon is only 43 years of age, and by the age of 20, this young man from a rather modest Corsican aristocratic family had become a household word all over France. Like Caesar, Napoleon grew up in revolutionary times. The French Revolution broke out in 1789. I believe, as some of you know, that America is unique, that we have a unique destiny, a unique history. And I ponder often the fact that in the very year in which George Washington was inaugurated, a revolution broke out in one of the wealthiest, best educated countries in all of Europe. And that revolution, the French Revolution, ended not with a constitution that still gives us peace and prosperity and freedom today, but with anarchy, systematic terror, and the establishment of an emperor in the form of Napoleon. He was commissioned an officer, a second lieutenant in the artillery. He gained a reputation for the siege carried out around the naval base at Toulon. Then, with a whiff of grape shot, in 1795, he was catapulted into higher rank, using his cannons to drive away a mob bent upon overthrowing the government. Then, seeking his destiny in the East, he got a commission to go out to Egypt, Why, he was even elected a member of the Academy of Sciences and Letters. Took with him a boatload full of scholars, artists, to discover the secrets of Egyptian civilization. Because of his invasion of Egypt, the Egyptian hieroglyphs were translated, but he failed really in Egypt. He won a couple of battles, drove out the old corrupt regime of the Mamelukes in Cairo. But the British Navy, which would always be his serious problem, defeated his fleet at the Battle of the Nile. Well, now he rode off into the Middle East and besieged cities like Accra. But unlike some crusaders who came before him, he failed to capture at least one of these cities. Tossed his hat in. That was as far as he got. What his troops got was bubonic plague. And Napoleon left him there to die, to go back to Paris, to ensure his position in the rapidly changing governments of France. Some even say that he had many of them shot rather than have them suffer from this plague. It would not be the last time that Napoleon would desert his army. And by 1802, having won a series of battles that still resound through military history, particularly in the north of Italy, he has been chosen consul for life. Very much like Caesar, dictator for life. But unlike Caesar, he can take that next step. And with the full support of the French people, who had created a revolution in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity, he was, in 1804, crowning himself, as a matter of fact, Emperor of France. It was his view, like Caesar, that true liberty, true equality, true fraternity came only under absolute rule. Democracy was a failed form of government. The French Revolution had proved that the French people could not govern themselves. The French Revolution had proved that constitutional governments did not work. What was needed was an absolute rule by an overwhelming world historical figure. And that was what Napoleon believed himself to be. And under his rule, then not only the people of France, but all of Europe, even perhaps the Middle East, perhaps even Persia, with whose Shah he made an alliance, the whole world might come to enjoy the fruits of liberty, which meant the freedom to live as you choose, as long as you harm no one else. And with that freedom, you are free to rise as far on the social scale as you can go, make as much money as you can make, take care of your family, and you are relieved of the awesome burden of self-government. Equality, all would be equal under the emperor. All would be protected under the laws that he put in place. And fraternity. Here he drew upon the mission of Alexander the Great, who was another of his heroes. The idea of the brotherhood of the human race, all under the rule of Napoleon. And like Caesar, he set about to not only restore the greatness of France by military adventures, but also to revitalize France through the reorganization of its government. And the code that he had put together, the law code, is still one of the great legacies of Napoleon, not only to France, but to other parts such as Italy, Latin America, even Germany, still bear part of the imprint of the Napoleonic Code. Now, he was surprised when his liberty, equality, and fraternity, his vision of a liberal Europe, embracing these ideas, was rejected by countries like Spain. Now, here were the Spaniards groaning under a corrupt, inefficient, brutal government dominated by the church, And when he invaded Portugal and brought his liberal ideas on into Spain, why, the Spaniards rose up against him and joined alliance with his most hated foe, the British. Napoleon could never understand the British. They were a nation of shopkeepers to him. And yet time and time again, on the sea, as at battles like Trafalgar, or in this long and gruesome war, the Peninsular War, fought in Spain, British troops beat his troops. The General Wellington, a nonentity as far as Napoleon was concerned, nonetheless had the strategic genius to keep Napoleon's forces in large numbers tied down. And then there was the trouble with the partisans. In Spain, despite the backward character of their government, these Spaniards were willing to die for their national freedom. As he would later write, the war in Spain was my greatest mistake. But elsewhere things went magnificently. Victory followed upon victory. Coalitions would be formed against him by the Prussians, by the Austrians, all of them backed, payrolled by the British. The Russians would join coalitions, and time again he would win magnificent victories, like Austerlitz, would pass into military history in almost mythic terms as Napoleon's troops came up the slope into the face of the cannons of the Austrians and Russians, and the sun would shine upon their bayonets as the fog lifted, and with sheer courage they drove back the Russian and Austrian troops and won an enduring victory. All of these battles, one glorious conquest after another, until finally, by 1809, he seemed master of Europe. He had created a continental system to outfox the British. Within that continental system, his allies such as Russia, Prussia, Spain, still fighting against him, Italy, the Low Countries, all of these were united into a trade unit. They traded only with themselves, and the importation of British goods was forbidden. But the Tsar of Russia never accepted the greatness of Napoleon. The Tsar of Russia came to feel ever more a mystical sense that he was the man of destiny, Tsar Alexander. He broke with Napoleon's system, and to punish him, in 1812, on June the 22nd, a decree of war was put forth, and 2 days later, the troops of Napoleon began to cross into the Russian Empire. It truly was a grand army, 600,000 strong, not just Frenchmen, but many Germans willingly serving in the army of Napoleon because they believed he would bring about a united Germany under a liberal government. There were troops from Belgium, many troops from Poland who looked upon Napoleon as their savior, and he had promised that he would restore an independent Poland. And so they marched forward. But the Russians were wily. Their generals were old but capable, and they understood that going all the way back to the time of Darius, all the way back to what was described in Herodotus as the attempt by the Persian king to invade Scythia or Russia, the real ally of the Russian, their strongest weapon was the size of the country. The endless steppes over which the army of Napoleon passed day after day, all through that hot, dry, dusty summer. And the Russians refusing to give battle. Now, it is the mark of a great general, like Scipio Africanus, who conquered Hannibal, that you can force the enemy to battle. Napoleon wasn't able to do it. But suddenly, on September the 7th, the Russians turned and faced him not far from Moscow at Borodino. And in a savage, bloody battle, the Russians were ultimately driven from the field. But the losses that Napoleon had incurred made him think back to his classics and the idea of a Pyrrhic victory, where you have lost so many men that while it may be a tactical victory, it is a strategic defeat. Here was Napoleon and his army, their lines of communication, their supply lines stretched very, very thin, marching further and further. But right ahead lay Moscow with its golden domes. And there in Moscow, you would find the provisions, the shelter, the housing. And no doubt once he had captured Moscow, Tsar Alexander himself would come and accept terms of surrender. Moscow was captured. There was almost nobody there. Then the fires broke out. There were no provisions in Moscow, and the city itself was half burned. So Napoleon was faced with this dilemma. One wonders how a Caesar would have faced it, or if a Caesar would ever found himself in that dilemma. Should he stay the winter in a burnt-out city where the land all around had been scorched, so there were no crops available, in the midst of a hostile population? Because the Russian people, no more than the Spaniards, wanted liberty, equality, and fraternity. To them, the dearest thing was Holy Mother Russia. And here was this atheist bringing these foreign ideas into Russia. Russia, which was the land of autocracy and absolutism and orthodoxy. They did not want liberal ideas. Decision had to be made, and the great army began its withdrawal. The other invincible weapon of the Russians has always been their winter. It came early that year, the October days bringing heavy snow. There was nothing to eat all along the way. The land had been burned and scorched. And Napoleon's men pressed on. A potato a day was a feast. Then the Cossacks began to attack them. The Russian army moved along their flank, slashing at them, attacking and then withdrawing. And the hunger and starvation grew worse and worse. And the freezing temperatures, these men in their overcoats that might have been suitable for a mild winter in Paris, but were nothing against the 30 to 40 below temperatures of Russia. Napoleon was faced with the same decision Caesar had been faced with when in his first campaign in 58 against the Helvetii, he was running out of food. Well, Caesar found a way to bring the Helvetii into battle, carried out a strategic retreat, tricked them, and crushed them utterly. But Napoleon didn't do this. Instead, this emperor of France, this man who would wear the mantle of Caesar, told his coach to take him back to Paris. Well, he was needed in Paris, and he needed to explain what had happened and give the right view of things. So while his men killed each other over a potato, while one man kept 3 potatoes hidden in his shirt all through the night, while on all sides of him, his comrades moaned and finally died of starvation. And the wolves came and took away their bodies. Napoleon glides back on his carriage with its, like a sled, and there, wrapped up in heavy fur coats, he eats either lamb or beef, depending on the best quality for the day, rice and beans, these are his favorite vegetables. He was quite a glutton, really. He had a big pot belly. And drank the finest of the wines of Burgundy, his favorites. No Caesar would ever have left his men to starve like that. And though the numbers vary, no more than 60,000 out of those 600,000 ever made their way back to the territory of Napoleon. And still today, mass graves are uncovered in countries like Lithuania with the tattered coats, the metal buttons, and the bones of the Grand Army. And now the fury of Europe turned upon him. The Battle of Leipzig, he was defeated in 1813. His military genius seemed to desert him, unlike Caesar, who was as good a general at the end as he was at the beginning. Napoleon was defeated at Leipzig. The Allies closed around him, the hated British, the triumphant Russians, the Prussians now revitalized, and he was finally forced to abdicate. But he was placed in a generous confinement on the island of Elba. He seemed to take an interest in the little island and undertook some projects to improve his agriculture. But all that time, he dreamed of returning. And the Bonapartists, his followers in France, were not going to let this end. And thus, he escaped. And in the glorious 100 days, he rallied France for one more mighty struggle. When he landed in France, the restored king of the Bourbons, Louis XVIII, sent troops to arrest Napoleon. Many of them were his old soldiers, and when they leveled their guns at him, he opened his coat, baring his breast, and said, "Here, shoot your emperor." Instead, they embraced him, and it was a heroic procession all the way to Paris. But the Allies were not going to allow this. And so the coalition gathered its forces. One last battle, one last throw of the dice. But unlike Caesar, Napoleon lost. At Waterloo, he was outgeneraled by that mediocrity, the Duke of Wellington. The British troops held their line. The Prussian troops arrived just in time, and even sending the old guard into action led only to more bloodshed. Napoleon himself suffered so badly from hemorrhoids that day that he could barely sit his horse, and was so distracted by the pain of the hemorrhoids that his instructions, his orders, were frequently incoherent. So do the small things decide history. This time, he hoped that he could flee to the United States. There was a cult of Napoleon in the United States, particularly on the frontier, and men like Andrew Jackson. They despised the British, and they hero worshiped Napoleon. And after all, he had sold us the Louisiana Purchase at a rock-bottom price. He believed he could find asylum in Britain, or at least in the United States. And he went to a British ship, and the British captain told him, "On my word of honor, Monsieur l'Empereur, we will take you first to Britain, and then we will take you on to the United States. That has been decided. I have your word as an English officer and gentleman." "Yes, you do." Napoleon stepped aboard the Bellerophon and was told, "You are now a prisoner." They weren't taking him to the United States. There's a profoundly moving engraving of Napoleon at that moment on the British ship. A few British officers standing away from him, some in awe, some with contempt on their face, and Napoleon looking across out into nothing, conquered at last. And there he passed his final days on St. Helena, a bleak South Atlantic island, persecuted in petty ways by the British governor, Hudson Lowe. Couldn't even take a long walk. His parameters were so limited. And almost day by day, the pain in his stomach growing ever greater. For it is certain that the governor was poisoning him with arsenic, and thus he died on May the 5th, 1821. France, tête d'armée, Josephine. France, head of the army, and his beloved Josephine. Now, Karl Marx once wrote that Hegel somewhere said that history first, great historical events, great historical personages, first appear as tragedy, and then a second time as farce. And there would be another Napoleon. His young son, Napoleon II, died, but there was Napoleon III, the nephew of the great Napoleon, the son of his brother Louis, who was for a while king of a puppet government in Holland that Napoleon the Great had established. And this little Napoleon was born in 1808, had an adventuresome youth, became involved in liberal politics and liberal, almost anarchical movements, developed some almost socialistic ideas. And France once again went through revolutions. And in 1848, the last of the kings, of the Bourbon kings, Louis Philippe, was driven out by a spontaneous uprising. And just as Napoleon the Great had made use of the French Revolution, thus just as Caesar had made use of the Roman Revolution, so this Napoleon used the opportunity first to gain control of Parliament and then to have himself named emperor. First president of France and then emperor in 1852. Victor Hugo, who admired the great Napoleon, saw right through this petit Napoleon, the little Napoleon. But the little Napoleon sought to wear the mantle of Caesar. In fact, he wrote probably the best book ever written on Julius Caesar. 2 volumes, Life of Julius Caesar. He restored the empire. It's a different kind of empire this time. It was an empire of businessmen, and with a few sops thrown out to the poorer people in forms of entitlements. But this was a place where you made big money, started the Suez Canal, created an empire in Algeria and in Indochina. And Napoleon was one of the strutting figures of the world stage. The Confederacy waited in vain for Napoleon to recognize them. Maximilian in Mexico went to his death as part of the grand schemes of this petit Napoleon. But Prussia, under its statesman, and he was a true statesman, Otto von Bismarck, knew that this petit Napoleon and his French Empire would be the catalyst that would unify Germany. Bismarck found a cause for war, and Napoleon, thinking that he had the military genius of the great Napoleon, led his army out, and the crowd shouted and waved, "Vive la France!" And in a matter of months, the French army was broken. Napoleon was in captivity, the empire collapsed, and the Prussians proclaimed the unity of all Germany in the halls of Versailles, the utter humiliation. This Napoleon was allowed to go to exile in England. There he lived out his last days. The great Napoleon would have been proud of the son of Napoleon III. He enlisted in the British Army, served as an officer in one of its best regiments, and died in action in the Zulu War. Not long after, Le Petit Napoleon began to fade away. He had loved his son. He had lost everything. The great defeat at Sedan was his Waterloo. But he died again in an almost farcical way. He was being operated on for kidney stones. The doctor bungled the operation, refused to admit it. Blood poisoning set in, and this Napoleon's last words were you at Sedan? Were you there when I was defeated? So, Caesar, it is a difficult mantle to wear. And it is most interesting that Churchill, who perhaps in the 20th century is the equivalent of Caesar, loved to surround himself with the memorabilia of Napoleon.